The art history scheme I devised and undertook during my school placement 1 block was an introduction into early Christian Ireland, with a focus on metalwork. This scheme was carried out over 4 lessons, each 40 minutes long, with a 5th year group of 16 students in Moat Community School, County Westmeath. My rationale for carrying out this scheme was simply down to it being my cooperating teacher's request, as this was the next section this class group were due to cover on her subject plan. Taking my cooperating teacher's overall aims for the subject into consideration, I began to decide on the aims and objectives for this scheme, by asking what do we, myself, the cooperating teacher and the students, want to achieve. A set of coherently planned teaching strategies have been outlined in order to support student learning, engagement and achievement. Keeping the end goal in mind, I wanted the students to feel able and confident to answer an exam type question under exam conditions during their last lesson. The submissions would also be a method of assessment. In order to elicit this confidence and preparedness in the students, I deemed it most important to engage the students in the learning experience from the outset, bearing the 3 elements, attentiveness, receptiveness, and appropriateness in mind. My cooperating teacher had admitted to me that she herself lacks interest and enthusiasm in the Irish art section, and would therefore mainly use the textbook as her resource and students reading aloud as her methodology, admitting that this rarely excites and stimulates the students' interest. Identifying learning aims in advance allows for the use of multiple methodologies in a planned, effective, structured way for the students to explore the subject matter. Therefore, the first aim on my agenda when planning this scheme was to broaden the variety of resources and methodologies to include PowerPoints, the use of ICT, be this showing YouTube clips, making use of online resources, or displaying a broader selection of images of the subject matter for students' reference, group work, handouts, practical activities, questioning, discussions during and at the end of lessons, illustrations, a variety of visual aids, and of course, reading. The variety in methodologies, strategies and resources would also accommodate different learning styles and differentiation within the class group. PowerPoints were created for each lesson. These were to be presented in conjunction with the information from the students' textbooks, a selection of high-quality printouts of the subject matter, passed around during the lessons, along with planned and prepared questions to prompt group discussion throughout. The first lesson was an overall introduction into early Christian Irish art, where I began by giving students an overview of the Leaving Cert exam and explained that we would be focusing on metalwork for the next few lessons. I wanted to engage the students by placing and posing questions throughout the lesson, which drew on their previous knowledge and learnings. The aim here was for the students to experience success and to feel confident to answer these questions, so as that they would be receptive to, motivated by, and interested in the learning. In an attempt to relate potentially new information to the class group, I placed and posed specific questions with accompanying visual and oral hints, such as naming an early monastery, like Clonmacnoise, which was only a couple of miles up the road from the school, or using the recent press regarding the filming of Star Wars as a hint for naming the location of another. Knowing that the class group had already covered pre-Christian Ireland, I tried to highlight and relate information from this lesson, again by posing lower order thinking questions that drew upon their previous knowledge and comprehension. These questions included: can someone explain what the corbelling technique is? Where did you come across this technique before? You have covered Latin style previously. What period was this? What are the main characteristics of this style? The presentation concluded with a brief overview of early Christian metalwork, where I explained to the class that we would be mainly focusing on 2 artefacts and answering an exam question in a couple of weeks based on what we will be covering. My main fault in the planning and execution of this lesson was that it ended far too early, and I did not do enough to promote further learning through discussion for the duration of the class period. Certain students were intrigued by the mentioning of an exam in a few weeks, whereas others didn't bat an eyelid, the latter being the lower ability, less motivated students. Looking back, I believe I should have emphasised the exam more at this time and given the students an opportunity to ask questions about this and what it would entail to heighten their interest and to extrinsically motivate them to do well. Rather than focusing only on the fact that they would have to answer an exam question in a few weeks, it would have been beneficial at this stage for the students to talk about how they would answer an exam question in a few weeks by discussing and brainstorming essay planning and modes of doing so, such as mind maps. The following lesson introduced the Ardagh Chalice. Sharing the learning intentions with the class was a method I used, again with the aim to elicit receptiveness with the group. Before moving on any further, I asked different students to read these aloud and then question their understanding of this. The information within the PowerPoint was compiled from a variety of sources, so that there were a wider vocabulary used in the explanation of key elements, such as the description of the form or the function of the subject matter. Rather than finding this more confusing, I hope that this would address differentiation in regard to the different levels of literacy that all students will be able to understand and relate to some of the terminology included, be this from their textbooks, from my presentation, from my own dialogue, or from the preceding handouts I would issue to the class. This was also my aim for having high-quality printouts of the chalice passed around for review during the presentation, and for including a multitude of images of the artefact from different angles and perspectives within the presentation itself. Towards the end of the presentation, students were again reminded that they would be answering an exam question in a few lessons' time, in exam conditions. Displaying this slide for a few minutes before moving on, I asked the group to brainstorm about how they would structure a response to this question, encouraging and probing them to focus on actually reading the question, noticing the key words. Taking this a step further, I asked how they thought marks would be allocated for such a question, what they believed were the most important elements to include and to cover in their answers. Unfortunately, this did not generate as much discussion as I had hoped, with the majority of students simply stating materials, decoration, form and function. Giving a brief breakdown of the marking scheme, we talked about illustrating your answer and what purpose this served. I felt as if this discussion was more successful in that all students responded with answers such as to show that you know what you're on about, to support your writing visually, to visually show the descriptions of the work of art you had written. And thankfully, I got a specific answer that I had actually hoped for when I asked, how would you ensure to do this, to support your writing? One student replied, by labelling your illustrations. A homework assignment of completing some illustrations was then assigned with examples of the standard expected of students highlighted to them. Overall, the illustrations submitted the following week were of a good standard. However, only 3 of the 12 were labelled. As I had gotten the aforementioned answer about this, I did not emphasise the point any further. However, looking back now, I realise that I should have gone beyond accepting one student out of the class group's answer as an indicator that all students understood this point and comprehended its relevance to their homework task. The next week's lesson was conducted in a very similar fashion to the previous, with the PowerPoint including a variety of terminology, imagery and sources of information. The class were assigned a similar homework assignment, except this time there was more of an emphasis placed on labelling the illustrations in a way that supported their written descriptions. Thankfully, this emphasis seemed to work as all submissions were labelled the following week. Rather than concluding the lesson by breaking down the exam question as before, I passed around some high-quality printouts of the 2 artefacts and asked the students to compare and contrast these aloud. The classroom climate was good and I had gotten a lot of interaction and input from the students so far, so I was hoping for this momentum to continue. However, looking back now, I believe I should have given more structure to or guidelines for the task, having a prepared set of questions that would assist the group in reaching a level of higher order thinking and really analysing the subject matter. The prompting questions should have served as a cognitive scaffolding upon which to build an understanding, and rather I focused too much on questions which drew upon their lower levels of cognitive ability, resulting in the students merely describing the aesthetic qualities of the 2 artefacts in plain English, and not being prompted to or given an opportunity to demonstrate an actual comprehension of the descriptive language, new words and terminology covered in the lesson, or to interpret analyse or evaluate the subject matter. Although I did allow and advise students to refer to their books to compare and contrast the metalworking techniques used for both artefacts, being conscious of the time and not allowing sufficient waiting time between posing a question and receiving a response, I feel as if I spoon-fed the answers to the group through my body language, facial expressions, pitch and tone of voice, as well as regularly answering my own questions. My suspicions of this not being as valuable, memorable or meaningful a learning experience as it had the potential to be seemed warranted when correcting the group's exam question answers the following week. Students were assessed on their progress and performance in this scheme through both formative and summative assessment. Participation and engagement during class time, the submission of homework assignments, and the overall attitude to learning were included in the rubrics and monitored on a lessonly basis. Formative feedback was given in the form of individual written commentary on each student's homework, where their successes and shortcomings were highlighted, with each including a clear description of how this could be best improved. I believe that taking the time to do this and ensuring each comment was specific, justified and framed in a positive, supportive way was a successful strategy. There was a notable improvement in the quality and amount of work submitted each week. Students also answered a past exam question. The grades awarded for this range from 26 to 84%. Although there were a handful of very low grades, the feedback that I received is that each student not only performed to their best ability, but also exceeded any previous grades in the subject. I chose to use a past exam question so that I had a marking scheme to refer to when correcting. Even with this as a reference point, I still struggled with the task. I found myself referring back to my notes, my slides, the textbook and all the online resources I had used to check and recheck any information given in their answers. Therefore, this became a very time-consuming and tiring effort. As I am not an expert in the field just yet, I doubted the reliability of the marks I awarded and sought the advice of my cooperating teacher who checked over these grades and the individual feedback given, which were sound. The scheme, of course, had its shortcomings, which have been a very valuable experience for me as a teacher. If I were to carry out the scheme of work again in the future, I'd firstly ensure to make the students aware of the purpose of their learning experience and the high expectations I have of them. This will be done through briefing the students about the learning tasks and activities that are going to be undertaken, and then revisiting this by debriefing the students at the end of the lesson about the nature of the learning that should have been accomplished. Although I believe I did this to some regard, it was more so done in the following lesson through general recapping, where I did not implement any specific strategies to monitor, check and reinforce pupils' understanding. Upon reflection of this scheme, I believe it would have been beneficial to have carried out some practical group work tasks specifically designed to achieve the intended outcomes. It was only when I was preparing to finish up my placement that I received a copy of this PDST resource, which included the scheme shown in the next few slides, where a display poster was created as a learning activity. During 2 of my lessons, I had hoped for the students to analyse imagery of the artefacts and to describe these using the correct terminology. This didn't gather as much input as I had hoped for. If a more structured activity, such as the creation of a display poster where the purpose of the activity was shared with the group previous to its undertaking, was implemented, then this could have been a far more valuable learning experience for the group. Overall, I do believe that this scheme was successful and engaging for the students. The main successes for me as a student teacher were that I was confident in my subject knowledge, exposition and delivery. This filtered through the classroom climate, and my efforts to relate the lessons to students' previous knowledge and interests, combined with me myself displaying a genuine interest in the subject matter, simulated receptiveness within the group. Through the use of formative feedback and constant encouragement for each student to partake in discussions and other class activities, the class, I believe, understood that I had a genuine concern and interest for their individual progress. This is apparent from the expectation exceeding grades awarded and the quality of homework submitted over the course of the scheme.